Our first speaker this morning, however, is Dr. Manisha Sinha, the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and a 2022 Guggenheim Fellow. She received her PhD from Columbia University, where her dissertation was nominated for the Bancroft Prize, discussing the abolitionist origins of the Civil War constitutionalism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sinha to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob Travers, for the very generous introduction. And I am really happy to be here in sunny Virginia. It's considerably warmer here than New England. I'd also like to thank Carrie Jetty for organizing this wonderful symposium, and Kelly Hancock and Cara Sisson for all the help they gave us as speakers to be here. So thanks all. I think my PowerPoint should be loaded up by now. Is that correct? It is there? You can see it? Okay, and I can move it from here? This seems, is this it? Is this the movie? Okay. All right. I can't see my PowerPoint, so hopefully. On the floor. Oh, right there. Okay. Well, yeah, as you can see, I'm very adept at technology. So let me begin now that I've taken care of that. So on the eve of the Civil War, when the political success of the Republican Party in the North seemed imminent, most abolitionists felt that they and the Free Soilers were part of a grand anti-slavery political coalition. Now, the relationship between the abolition movement and political anti-slavery in the antebellum North was intimate and symbiotic, but they were not one and the same. Writing about the Revolutionary era, David Bryan Davis, the great historian of slavery, contended that abolition was, quote, the most activist expression of anti-slavery. Now, if we were to draw a Venn diagram to represent abolition as a social movement and free soil political parties, radical Republicans would inhabit the middle of two overlapping circles. The anti-slavery platform, call it Freedom National, a la Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, or the, quote, denationalization of slavery, like Salmon P. Chase of Ohio, both founders of the anti-slavery Republican Party, was not abolition, but it could lead or pave the way to abolition. Most abolitionists understood that, as did most Southern slaveholders, at least those from the Deep South, who viewed free soilism as an existential threat and used the election of Abraham Lincoln on that platform as good reason to secede from the Union. We cannot, however, collapse abolitionism into republicanism or vice versa. The politics of abolition, like its constituency, was multifaceted, diverse, and contentious. No one slogan or program can encapsulate it, except perhaps human rights, a term abolitionists first popularized. Now, abolitionists' rich debates over the nature of the United States Constitution and the use of law and government action to not just destroy slavery, but establish African American citizenship had fed into that outcome. If anti-slavery constitutional theory was the vehicle through which Republican politicians pushed the abolitionist agenda, its abolitionist roots deserve more attention. Now, before the Civil War, sectional compromise and the desire to preserve the Union and reverence for the constitutional compact between the states thwarted abolitionist aims. The Constitution, Northern emancipation laws passed during the Revolutionary era, and anti-slavery jurisprudence were not sufficient in and of themselves to establish the freedoms principle, even in the North, and to challenge the extraterritoriality of the laws of Southern slavery claimed by enslavers. Behind every landmark anti-slavery decision, starting with the famous Somerset case in 1772 in Britain to the Dred Scott decision in 1857, lay an enslaved litigant and abolitionist lawyers. Now, the rise of interracial immediatism, or the demand for the immediate abolition of slavery by Black and white abolitionists, the rejection of anti-slavery gradualism and colonization, the program to repatriate free African Americans back to Africa, one that was very popular among some Virginian slaveholders, and the adoption of moral suasion as a tactic never led to the abandonment of political and legal strategies by abolitionists. Abolitionists combined radical rhetoric with circumspect means, reviving early petition campaigns for abolition in the District of Columbia and against the admission of new slave states, something that the federal government could constitutionally do. Yet they were frequently the target of mob violence, North and South, as fanatics who threatened the Union and the Constitution. The lessons of the 1830s made William Lloyd Garrison and his followers move towards non-resistance, a radical critique of the church and state and women's rights. Garrison's political critics sought to purge the movement of his heresies that threatened to make abolition even more unpopular. But far from an extremist minority, abolitionism had an impact on the national political arena, leading John C. Calhoun, the leading spokesman from South Carolina of pro-slavery interests, leading Calhoun's lieutenants to make respectful inquiries of James Birney, Secretary of the American Anti-Slavery Society, on the exact strength of its affiliates' membership. Now, the Anti-Slavery Committee of Joshua Leavitt and Theodore Weld, and hopefully this will work, it did. And Theodore Weld can be seen here on your left. He was such a good-looking abolitionist. I always tell my husband I'd leave him, for Theodore Weld, if he was still alive. Anyway, Joshua Leavitt, as well as the work of other abolitionists like Benjamin Lundy and David Lee Child, alerted anti-slavery politicians to slaveholders' quote, atrocious plot to annex Texas, and fed them abolitionist research for their speeches. In 1838, Weld published The Power of Congress over the District of Columbia, in which he argued that the constitutional power of the federal government to legislate for the district was so clear that it, quote, defies misconstruction. Weld also researched, quote, the rights of colored citizens under the U.S. Constitution, insisting, like most abolitionists, that the Constitution's equal privileges and immunities clause applied to free African Americans who were citizens of the northern states. Now, abolitionist ideas made some headway when federal courts held that the southern states' Negro seaman laws, which imprisoned all free black seamen visiting southern ports, violated the Constitution and American treaties with foreign powers. Now, the next year, the abolitionist judge William J., pictured here on your right, explicitly connected the powers of the federal government with black citizenship. Despite holding, quote, our fathers, here the son of John Jay is speaking literally, guilty of the constitutional compromises over slavery, he argued that the Constitution recognized no difference based on color. But the federal government, quote, oppress and degrade the free people of color, he noted, with its racist citizenship and militia laws that were all passed in the 1790s. It had used its power, in particular, to debase the free black population of the district with a host of petty restrictions and aided enslavers, quote, in trampling upon these great principles of human rights by operating on the assumption that all free blacks were fugitive slaves. Jay listed the names and stories of black people held in DC prisons and at times sold because they had no slaveholding claimants. Domestically and internationally, the United States government acted as a handmaiden of slavery, he claimed, violating constitutionally guaranteed rights of citizens, upholding the domestic slave trade and Southern slavery, refusing to recognize, quote, the heroic Republic of Haiti, which the Lincoln administration eventually recognized, warring against the Seminoles in Florida, demanding rendition of fugitive slaves and compensation for slave rebels, tolerating an illegal African slave trade, infringements on civil liberties and freedom of speech of abolitionists, and plotting to annex Texas. Now, implicit in Jay's argument was the notion that Northerners could redeem the federal government from being a tool of slaveholders. The rapid sale of his pamphlet led to a second edition in 1844. In a companion pamphlet on the condition of the free people of color, Jay listed the disabilities on black citizenship in the slaveholding republic. The lack of, quote, elective franchise, denial of rights of locomotion, impediments to education, susceptibility to enslavement, and subjection to insult and outrage. The federal government not only sustained but subsidized slavery, reimbursing its functionaries, particularly army officers in the frontiers, for employing slave labor. With good reason, abolitionists and anti-slavery politicians made redeeming the federal government from the clutches of, quote, the slave power their highest priority. Now, unlike Weld and Jay, who did not challenge the federal consensus that the federal government had no authority to interfere with Southern slavery, some Liberty Party constitutionalists went further. And the Liberty Party was a political party founded by abolitionists in the 1840s. A lawyer and one of the founders of the party, Alvin Stewart, argued that the Constitution's guarantees of citizenship, which were violated by slavery, allowed the federal government to directly abolish slavery in the Southern states. He pronounced slavery unconstitutional on the basis of the Fifth Amendment, which stipulated that no person could be deprived of life, liberty, and property without the due process of law. In, quote, a constitutional argument on the subject of slavery, Stewart urged that the federal government ought to abolish slavery in order to fulfill the constitutional guarantee of Republican government in the Southern states, that is, representative government, and in accordance with the general welfare. This is exactly the clause that Republicans would use to justify Reconstruction after the Civil War. Now, Stewart died in 1849, and though Free Soilers rejected his constitutional views, he influenced radical political abolitionists such as Gerrit Smith, William Goodell, and after his break with the Garrisonians, Frederick Douglass. The emergence of political abolitionism forced Garrison and his allies to develop their own stance on politics, often mischaracterized as an outdated adherence to moral suasion or as apolitical. Rejecting electoral politics, Garrisonians developed the politics of agitation. The fugitive slave controversy played a crucial role in Garrison's rejection of what he called a pro-slavery union and constitution. In 1842, Chief Justice Joseph Story, in the Supreme Court case Prigg versus Pennsylvania, declared Northern personal liberty laws that gave free blacks and suspected fugitives certain legal protections, due process, and trial by jury unconstitutional. That year, Garrison announced his doctrine in The Liberator, quote, a repeal of the union between Northern liberty and Southern slavery is essential to the abolition of one and the preservation of the other. For Garrisonians, disunionism was a concerted attack on slaveholders' political power and not a retreat into inaction. By 1844, the official policy of the Garrison-led American Anti-Slavery Society became, quote, no union with slaveholders. The Union, Garrison pointed out in his, quote, address to the Friends of Freedom and Emancipation in the United States, was bought, quote, at the expense of the colored population of the country. Now, Garrison expected opposition at, quote, so bold and revolutionary a step. But in advocating separation, the American Anti-Slavery Society had taken, he argued, the highest possible ground against slavery. Now, Garrison's condemnation of the Constitution as pro-slavery lay close to home. Now, unknown to historians, and this was one of my aha moments when I was researching my book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, Garrison derived his famous indictment of the Constitution as, quote, a covenant with death and an agreement with hell from the black abolitionist, Reverend James W.C. Pennington, pictured here. And this made sense to me because Pennington was a clergyman and Garrison was not known to quote the Bible. In 1842, at the height of the controversy over the fugitive slave George Latimer in Massachusetts, Pennington delivered a sermon to his Hartford congregation. Covenants involving moral wrong are not obligatory upon man, which began with a quotation from the book of Isaiah, and your covenant with death shall be disannulled, and your agreement with hell shall not stand. Now, Pennington argued that, quote, laws and compacts designed to legalize the system of human bondage, like the constitutional obligation to deliver up fugitive slaves, ought to be swept away, as they involved disobedience to God. Pennington evoked a higher law, long before it became popular with anti-slavery politicians such as William Seward in the 1850s. Pennington, who ironically was associated with the Tappanite wing of the abolition movement, those who were against Garrison, used that characterization for just the fugitive slave clause of the Constitution and the federal fugitive slave law. A fugitive slave himself, Pennington was a self-educated clergyman, teacher, and abolitionist known for his erudition. He wrote one of the first histories of Black people and a text disputing the pseudoscience of race. And this was in the 1840s. He became the first African American to be awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Heidelberg in 1849, and today the University of Heidelberg, at its 625th anniversary, endowed a fellowship in his name, and that was in 2011, and President Obama sent his felicitations for it, and I gave a talk there on Pennington because no one had heard of him. So now Garrison extended Pennington's biblical indictment of the fugitive slave clause and law to the entire Constitution. Garrisonian and political abolitionist stances on the nature of the Constitution developed in response to each other. In 1844, Wendell Phillips, a lawyer by training, presented the full-blown Garrisonian argument in, quote, the Constitution, a pro-slavery compact. Phillips went beyond the specific constitutional clauses dealing with slavery, though he listed all of them. Mining James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention debates, which had been first published in 1840, to prove the intent of the framers to protect slavery, Phillips concluded that the Constitution was, quote, an infamous bargain that proved the melancholy fact that our fathers bartered honesty for gain and became partners with tyrants, that they may profit from their tyranny. A radical abolitionist indictment of their sacrosanct, liberty-loving reputation. His pamphlet, though, began with a quotation from John Quincy Adams, that the very purpose of the federal government had been prostituted for the protection and preservation of slavery, and he conceded the argument of political abolitionists that the Constitution had been put to increasingly pro-slavery use over the years. But for Phillips, the Constitution as is, in its original form, was pro-slavery. A year later, can abolitionists vote or take office under the United States Constitution? Phillips argued that the American Anti-Slavery Society's opposition to a pro-slavery government and laws should not be mistaken as endorsing a no-government or non-resistant position, which abolitionists like Garrison and Lucretia Mott supported. Phillips argued that he had simply judged all institutions and documents, no matter how venerable, by the touchstone of anti-slavery principle and had found them wanting. The American Anti-Slavery Society published an expanded version of Phillips' pamphlet with an endorsement from its executive committee. It went through 3 editions and merited a response from the political abolitionists of the Liberty Party. Now, William Goodell's views of American constitutional law in its bearing upon American slavery, published in 1844, he's pictured here on your right, and Massachusetts lawyer Lysander Spooner's The Unconstitutionality of Slavery, published a year later in 1845, were the most detailed expositions of the political abolitionist position. Goodell's treatise began with the deceptively simple premise that the American government and Constitution cannot be viewed as neutral or even only, quote, partial on the subject of slavery. It must either be completely for or against liberty, as even a slight toleration of slavery would endanger all liberty. If it was pro-slavery, as the Garrisonians argued, then abolitionists would indeed have the right to revolution or submission. But, he argued, the slaveholders' pro-slavery reading of the Constitution was based on their complete rejection of democracy, their defense of slavery, and their contempt for the laboring masses, black and white. He refuted it with their own principle, slaveholders' principle, of strict construction, arguing that the Constitution did not recognize slavery, since slavery reduced human beings to chattel property, things, and the Constitution only alluded to, quote, persons. For Goodell, anti-slavery was bound up with the development of human freedom and republicanism, that is, representative government, in the Anglo-American world. The democratic spirit of the Constitution, with its positive exhortations on liberty and rights, like that of English common law, the Declaration of Independence, and he even included the New Testament, which all did not include specific abolitionist injunctions, were all anti-slavery. According to Goodell, all anti-slavery men need not be good Republicans, but all Republicans must be anti-slavery. His was the radical democratic interpretation that privileged ideas over facts that had been unearthed by Phillips. In a public letter to John G. Whittier, Gerrit Smith also called the Constitution, quote, a noble and beautiful temple of liberty, based on the defense of human rights that had simply been perverted to pro-slavery ends. Even the 3/5 clause, he argued, could not prevent a northern majority from voting in an anti-slavery government. And that's exactly what happened, of course, in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln. Now, similarly, according to Spooner, all law, especially constitutional law, must be based on principles of natural rights and justice. The fact that the African slave trade and slavery were, quote, tolerated in the American colonies was no argument for their legality. Also making a historical argument, Spooner wrote that slavery was not recognized in either the state constitutions or the Articles of Confederation that had preceded the Constitution. And if slavery did not have, quote, a constitutional existence earlier, it certainly did not under the United States Constitution, which recognized all people, including black people, as citizens. Like Goodell, Spooner argued that the Constitution recognized only persons and not chattels personnel. Persons held to service referred to servants and not slaves. Furthermore, the preamble referred to all the people of the United States, not just whites or free people or any such subset as citizens of the country. The only guarantee that the Constitution had did not concern slavery, despite the, quote, arrogant and bombastic claims of enslavers, but a republican form of government, a representative form of government, which slavery contravened. Spooner concluded that the anti-slavery nature of the Constitution guaranteed that all the children of the enslaved were born free and ought to be freed immediately by federal judges. Now, for Phillips, Goodell's and Spooner's beliefs were dangerous for abolitionist activists as they denied the possibility that governments and laws could be unjust. Abolitionists might as well bury their heads in the sand and wait for the law and the Constitution to work out their destiny. In his 1847 review of Spooner's book, Phillips proceeded to dismantle each one of his historical and constitutional arguments, but ended with genuine admiration for their ingenuity. In the constitutional debate, both sides did the other a disservice. While political abolitionists sought to harness the power of the federal government for abolition, Garrisonians, far from simply endorsing the pro-slavery constitutional argument of Calhounites, which many historians continue to argue, it drives me insane, but in any case, far from endorsing the arguments of slaveholders, were calling for its revolutionary remaking. And that is exactly what happens, of course, during Reconstruction with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Now, political abolitionists were more interested in dismantling slaveholders' constitutional claims than simply sparring with the Garrisonians. As in biblical interpretation, while slaveholders championed a literal and strict construction of the Constitution, abolitionists appealed to its liberal spirit. In the 19th century, if you had the Bible and the Constitution on your side, you pretty much won the debate. Now, anti-slavery constitutional theory emerged from this rich and long abolitionist debate on the relationship of slavery to the Constitution. Among abolitionists, there was no consensus on slavery and the Constitution, but anti-slavery politicians were able to distill the most effective political and constitutional anti-slavery strategy from this debate, sure to appeal to the largest numbers of Northern voters. They built on the political abolitionist idea that slavery was the creature of positive state law and in contravention to common law, the Declaration, and the Constitution. But they dropped their insistence on black citizenship, though they would come to it later on, and abolition in the southern states. The person who best developed what he called constitutional anti-slavery was the Ohio lawyer and politician Salmon P. Chase. Now, Chase was he was one of the founders of the Liberty Party, and of course, he became an advocate of broadening its appeal in the North. He used abolitionist ideas to reassure Northerners of the constitutionally legitimate nature of the anti-slavery political project. Unlike most political abolitionists, and conceding considerable ground to the Garrisonians, he argued that the Constitution actually protected slavery in the southern states, but that the founding principles of the country were anti-slavery as they visualized an end to slavery. The Constitution gave full powers and, in fact, made it the duty of the federal government to act against slavery in areas under it: the District of Columbia, the federal territories, the interstate slave trade, and most importantly, the Fugitive Slave Clause. Chase's notion of the, quote, divorce of the federal government from slavery became incorporated into the Liberty Party platform of 1844, and his slogan, the denationalization of slavery, became the rallying cry of the Free Soil Party, which was founded 4 years later after the Mexican War. These parties were all predecessors to the anti-slavery Republican Party founded in the 1850s. It was perhaps fitting that this adept theorist of anti-slavery constitutionalism succeeded Roger Taney, the avatar of pro-slavery constitutionalism and the author of the infamous Dred Scott decision that a black man had no rights that a white man was bound to respect. He succeeded Taney as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, appointed by the Lincoln administration. But the last word on anti-slavery constitutionalism also belongs to Charles Sumner, who was the senator from Massachusetts, and his idea of freedom national. He had this idea that once we provincialize and restrict Southern slavery, it would perforce die. And he was one of those senators who refused to accept the constitutionality of the federal fugitive slave laws and championed black equality boldly and openly on the Senate floor, for which, of course, he was assaulted by a South Carolinian representative. Now, the great black abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, put together all these ideas. In 1851, Douglass had announced his conversion from the Garrisonian doctrine that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document to the argument that it was anti-slavery and that it required political action against slavery. Douglass gained a much-needed infusion of funds for his newspaper from his new mentor, Gerrit Smith. He acquired the subscription list of the old Liberty Party newspaper, but also a black abolitionist, Samuel Ringgold Ward's Impartial Citizen, and he renamed his paper Frederick Douglass's paper. Again, it shows how black abolitionists at this time are advocating for black citizenship within the abolition movement at various levels, and that's part of the abolition program, not just the destruction of Southern slavery, but equal rights for black people. Like Smith, Douglass adhered to abolitionist rather than anti-slavery constitutional theory, but he also supported free soil parties like the Republican Party. He argued that the federal government had the constitutional authority to directly abolish slavery in the Southern states. Like most political abolitionists, Douglass combined a literal reading of the nation's founding legal document, stressing that neither slavery nor slaves were specifically mentioned in it, with the abolitionist insistence that constitutional guarantees of citizenship rights extended to African Americans. He went further. The original intent of its framers, many of whom he well knew were slaveholders, Douglass implied was irrelevant. This claim was bold in the context of 19th century American constitutionalism, when both slaveholding Southern and anti-slavery Northern politicians regularly sought to enlist the founders on their side of the sectional conflict over slavery. Anticipating modern constitutional theorists, Douglass argued that the Constitution was a living document whose democratic promise must be extended by subsequent generations. As he put it in his speech, which was published as a pamphlet in 1860, the Constitution of the United States, is it pro-slavery or anti-slavery? Slaveholders had given the US Constitution a pro-slavery interpretation, but the Constitution, quote, will afford slavery no protection when it shall cease to be administered by slaveholders. The real purpose of abolitionist constitutionalism was not to simply to stay true to the original intent of its framers, which no one, he said, could fathom, as pro-slavery literalists and strict constructionists argued, but to use it for anti-slavery purpose. Douglass did invoke the founding generation and their ideals, but in the matter of constitutional interpretation, he asked his and future generations to imagine black citizenship. By refusing to be held hostage to the original intent of the Constitution's framers, Douglass went well beyond contemporary constitutional debates over slavery and anticipated its remaking during the Civil War and Reconstruction. He imagined an interracial democracy in the United States and the overthrow of the lily-white slaveholding republic, an abolitionist goal that Republicans sought to achieve during Reconstruction. In the end, both the Garrisonians and the political abolitionists were proven right. Slavery was abolished through government action, but in the midst of the enormous bloodletting of the Civil War, a covenant with death indeed. Now, for long, abolitionists, like 20th century political theorists, had debated whether the American state was created as a tool of, quote, the slave power, or whether it was an arena of conflict, susceptible to anti-slavery influence. Despite their differences on the nature of the Union and Constitution, for abolitionists and radical Republicans, anti-slavery was the dominant principle of their politics. Lincoln's position represented that of a majority of anti-slavery moderates within the Republican Party. Lincoln's competing loyalties to the Union and Constitution had moderated his anti-slavery beliefs through much of his political career. For most anti-slavery moderates like Lincoln, the Union, Constitution, and anti-slavery represented dissonant, competing political loyalties. The slaveholders' rebellion solved that problem for him. During the revolutionary crisis generated by Southern secession and Civil War, Lincoln's competing political loyalties became compatible. The war allowed a majority of Northerners to align their commitment to the Union and, importantly, for a lawyer like Lincoln, to the Constitution with emancipation in the rebel states. Abolitionist constitutional thought, based on a vindication of Black citizenship rights, bore fruit during the crisis of the Union. When Lincoln abandoned colonization, that was the program he advocated before the Civil War and in the beginning of the war, and endorsed limited Black male suffrage before his death, the first American president to endorse Black citizenship, he inhabited abolitionist ground. Now, the agenda of Reconstruction fueled, by the refusal of former slaveholders to accept the results of the war and emancipation and Andrew Johnson's restoration policies. Of course, Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln after he was assassinated by the Confederate sympathizing actor John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated him not for emancipation, but on hearing him give a speech that endorsed Black citizenship. This agenda of Reconstruction that came into being by Republicans in Congress had long roots in abolitionist constitutionalism. For it to triumph fully, new federal laws guaranteeing Black civil rights had to be passed, and the Constitution had to be remade with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The fight for Black citizenship propelled American state formation during Reconstruction. It resulted in Black voting and office holding. Until today, reinforced by the events of the Civil Rights Movement, the Black view of the federal government as the guardian of citizenship rights stands in glaring contrast to conservative states' rights or anti-big government views. After 1877, the Romance of Reunion, and a narrow reading or misreading of the Reconstruction Amendments by the United States Supreme Court that brazenly flouted the intent of their Republican lawmakers would once again eclipse abolitionist constitutional principles. But it had been the long abolitionist struggle for human rights and Black citizenship that flowered during Reconstruction, its promise cut short by racial terror, disfranchisement, segregation, and sharecropping that made a mockery of Black freedom by the end of the 19th century. Thank you for listening so patiently. Thanks. I'd be happy to take any questions, comments, disagreements. Yes?
Hello. My question is, when Roger Taney was writing the Dred Scott decision, would he have been arguing specifically against points made by Weld and earlier abolitionist lawyers?
That's a really good question. Taney may not have been aware of the abolitionists like Weld or Goodell or even Garrison, though he certainly was aware of their existence. He may not have read their pamphlets. I don't have any evidence that he actually read abolitionist constitutional theory, but what he did read was anti-slavery constitutional theory. He did read Salmon Chase, he did know Charles Sumner's speeches, and he did know Lincoln's speeches. And the Dred Scott decision is interesting because not only does it say that black citizenship is impossible, and it says, how dare an enslaved man even sue for his freedom? He does not have the right to even sue. And this is ridiculous because going back to the 17th century, enslaved people sued for their freedom in Virginia, in slave colonies like Virginia. So Tawney is like just ignoring that and saying, you don't even have the right to sue, for you don't have any citizenship rights. But he's also trying to say that the political platform of the Republican Party, which was the non-extension of slavery, is unconstitutional. Tawney is saying slavery goes wherever the US Constitution goes. So it goes into the federal territories in the West, and the federal government had no constitutional authority to abolish slavery there. And that was ridiculous, that even the most conservative northern jurists like Benjamin Curtis says, that's absolutely wrong. I mean, that's not states' rights. It's like Calhoun's notion of state sovereignty to protect slavery everywhere. And so, yes, he is certainly aware of it, and the decision was actually a political decision to delegitimize the rise of the new anti-slavery Republican Party. Yes?
Great presentation, thank you. So the Confederate Constitution is a constitution that explicitly tries to endorse and support slavery. So how is their constitution different? How did they build it into their constitution?
So there's a debate, of course, about this, right? What is the Constitution's relationship to slavery? Today, you can read historians and lawyers arguing about it. They're still arguing about it. Slavery is long gone. That debate is still alive. If you were to ask my position, I talk about this a little bit in my book, clearly the Constitution has three distinct compromises over slavery, right? The 3/5 clause, the fugitive slave clause, and the clause that allows the federal government to abolish the African slave trade, but not before 1808. That was a compromise that the South Carolinians and Georgians wrung from the Constitutional Convention because they had lost so many enslaved people during the Revolution who had run away to the British that they wanted to recoup their losses. So the Constitution has these compromises over slavery. Does that make it a pro-slavery document? Does it make it an anti-slavery document? And in a way, it's a lot like the founding of the American Republic itself. It's contradictory. There are no easy answers here. What happens, of course, is that as the Republic is formed and as things go along, slaveholders, thanks to the 3/5 clause, have an iron lock on the federal government, the Senate, the United States Supreme Court, and they're able to, in fact, use the Constitution in very pro-slavery ways, in ways that probably the founders themselves did not imagine, right? The notion was, slavery would die off on its own, but it didn't. It was expanding, it was booming. It's the reason why they felt confident enough to secede from the American Republic and wage war against the United States to defend slavery, because it was not a dying institution, it was a booming institution. So they did that. So whatever compromises there were in the Constitution, the 3/5 clause probably gave them that kind of political power to do that. And until the rise of the anti-slavery Republican Party, the presidency, and other organs of the federal government were really dominated by slaveholders. I mean, beginning with the Virginia dynasty. And abolitionists developed a critique of that, and their critique was the slave power that had taken over the Republic, and that it was somehow challenging its founding ideals. Because there's a lot in the US Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, that is very forthrightly for liberties. And interestingly enough, when John Bingham wrote the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, he says, I'm going to nationalize the Bill of Rights. He came up with the word Bill of Rights. No one called the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution the Bill of Rights, till John Bingham called it that when he put forth the 14th Amendment, which was kind of a compromise with radical and moderate Republicans. But that document that establishes national birthright citizenship in the United States, that emerges from those original 10 amendments too. So yes, the Constitution, is it pro-slavery or anti-slavery? It's probably a good discussion to have even with students and to read the Garrisonians, to read the political abolitionists, and come up with your own opinion. I think it was definitely those three compromises on slavery, and it did sort of, for most abolitionists who were living right then in the 18th century, what I call the first wave of abolition from the Revolutionary era, they saw the Constitution as a setback to their cause. Because they said, if we can't even abolish slavery in the founding document of a republic devoted to human equality, when are we going to do it? And the way things turned out, you ended up with slaveholders using that document. But then abolitionists and black people are also using the same document to argue for their rights. So I think that's the nuanced answer that I would give. Thanks. Any other questions? Yes?
Hi, good morning. Great presentation. Thank you so much. I was really fascinated by the Reverend Pennington and when his thoughts with reference to laws and this covenant with death. It reminded me of Dr. King and just and unjust laws. And would like to get your thoughts on just comparing.
Yeah. That's a great question. If you look at the black political tradition, a lot of it is born in the church with clergymen, and they sort of emerge as leaders of the community because that was an autonomous black institution. You know, one of the first charters that a black institution gets as a separate, from the government is the black church, the AME church, right? That's a church that was attacked, actually, in Charleston. It was a historically black abolitionist church. And Pennington he's not a Methodist, he's a Presbyterian. He takes he's a fugitive slave, self-taught, becomes a school teacher, takes part in the black convention movements where black people gather at state and national levels to air their grievances. It's not as if African Americans, because they're treated as second-class citizens or because 90% of them are enslaved, are silent at this time. And I was fascinated by Pennington because he's writing all these treatises on the Constitution, against scientific racism, which was increasingly coming into vogue at that time, recovering the history of black people going back to Africa, talking about Christianity and how racism is an immoral thing because it's unchristian. He had all these theological ideas too, which was really interesting. And I got fascinated by his work, and I spent a lot of time talking about him in my book because I felt he was not known. There are some biographies of him out there, but no one really has heard of him, right? And that's why I ended up studying abolition. Because in that space, you can find conversations between black and white abolitionists and how they influence each other. And the fact that the University of Heidelberg recognized him for their 625th anniversary was fascinating to me, that they knew that they had given him this honorary doctorate because he was in all these international peace congresses in Paris, in London, in the World Anti-Slavery Conferences in London. These people were known internationally. We only hear about Douglass, because of course Douglass is important, and he overshadows everyone. But there are just so many black men and women who were involved in the abolitionist movement and who fought for equal rights in this country. And I think he's like one of those people we can read more about and know more about. Yeah.
So, that's really loud. A question from the live stream. Can you speak to the relationship of Taney and Lincoln during the Civil War? Was the Emancipation Proclamation challenged in the courts?
I'm sorry, could you raise your hand? I didn't hear the question. I didn't know where it was coming from.
I'm right back here. It's
okay.
From the live stream.
Oh, okay, sure, sorry.
So can you speak to the relationship of Taney and Lincoln during the Civil War, and was the Emancipation Proclamation challenged in the courts?
Very interesting question. So Lincoln is very careful to issue the Emancipation Proclamation using his war powers, right? And he doesn't just dream up of this idea one day that he's going to do it. John Quincy Adams had repeatedly said that the President of the United States can abolish slavery in the middle of a war using his war powers constitutionally. And abolitionists were fascinated with this idea. Garrison and Douglas started printing John Quincy Adams' ideas on the mastheads of their newspapers during the Civil War. William Whiting, who was a Solicitor General in the Lincoln administration and abolitionists, also made this argument to Lincoln. So Lincoln's adopting that argument. Was it constitutionally challenged? Well, of course, the Confederates thought it was outrageous that Lincoln had, and he was very careful. He only freed those enslaved people who were in areas that were still under rebellion. He had already issued a preliminary proclamation in September 1862 telling them that I'm going to do this if you stay in rebellion. So the warning had already been given. The Second Confiscation Act had already been passed by Congress that said enslaved people used in the Confederacy enslaved people of rebel slaveholders should be freed. The Emancipation Proclamation went further and said enslaved people of rebel, even if you were Unionist in sympathy, if that area was in rebellion, and he demarcates all those different places in the proclamation, would be free. And that's why it's such a legal document, because he was very careful about that. So of course the Confederates think this is outrageous. He even says to enslaved people, do not raise arms against your enslavers unless in self-defense. And immediately the Confederates say, oh, he's calling for slave rebellion. So they're thinking, all sorts of things, and that's unconstitutional. No one in the North says it's unconstitutional. Everyone buys the war powers theory idea. Lincoln himself knows this is just a proclamation and can be overturned by a subsequent precedent, by another executive order. That's what a proclamation, it's a 19th century word for an executive order. And that's why he spent so much political capital for the passage of the 13th Amendment. That part the Lincoln movie got right, a lot of other things it got wrong. But there was one person who did challenge the constitutionality of the Emancipation Proclamation. And interestingly enough, it was Benjamin Curtis, who had written the dissent in the Dred Scott decision. So Benjamin Curtis was a Northern conservative, and he wrote this, and no one knows this, so I came across this when I was reading the Emancipation, and I read his pamphlet saying that this was unconstitutional, that emancipation was unconstitutional. Now, of course, it did not get much play in the North, except among, what were known as Northern doughfaces, Northern Democrats sympathizing with the Confederacy and with Southerners later on. It doesn't get much play. But in fact, there are people who challenge emancipation on a constitutional basis. And one of them, ironically, was the dissenter in the Dred Scott decision, Benjamin Curtis. So yeah, there was one. Yes?
Thank you. We've got another question from the live stream. Can you speak to how Black women contributed to the intellectual debate on the constitutionality of slavery? And if possible, do you have additional reading suggestions related to this question?
What a wonderful question. Now, in the antebellum debate that I mentioned over the US Constitution, I did not evoke any African-American woman. Of course, I deal with them thoroughly in my book. A lot of Black women, like white abolitionist feminists, were connecting women's rights to the question of Black liberation. And they were doing this off the bat in 1820s and 1830s, which is quite amazing. So that discourse, of course, also emerges during Reconstruction with the rise of the suffrage movement and the split in the suffrage movement with the Anthony-Stanton wing opposing the 15th Amendment because it enfranchised Black men, but it did not enfranchise women, especially educated daughters of the Republic like themselves, and other abolitionist feminists who supported the 15th Amendment and saw it as the first step towards the enfranchisement of women, people like Lucy Stone. But in terms of a black woman who speaks eloquently about this, the person I would really mention is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. I didn't mention her in my presentation because in the antebellum period, she spent most of her time lecturing against slavery, and she wrote poetry and fiction. She was a very well-known 19th century author. She was called the Bronze Muse of the abolition movement. But during the Civil War and Reconstruction, she starts taking on constitutional issues. And it's really interesting to read those nonfiction essays, which many of the literary theorists who have written on Frances Ellen Watkins Harper don't pay attention to. So that's the source I would tell you to go to. I have a little piece on this in an online source, and if you just Google it, Manisha Sinha Commonplace, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, it'll bring up that piece, where I found essays that she had written with just her initials in black newspapers that people had not paid attention to. And here she is wonderful. She criticizes Lincoln for his colonization plans early in the war. Once emancipation comes, she is gung-ho for Lincoln and emancipation and black rights, and she's writing about that. And during Reconstruction, she's actually lecturing in the South amongst enslaved people, especially enslaved women. And she also is lecturing in big conventions like the National Women's Rights Convention of 1866, when the suffrage movement takes off, where she famously said, "You white women speak of rights. I, as a black woman, speak of wrongs." Again, connecting and intersecting the notion of black rights with women's rights. So I would say go to Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. There is a very good reader of her speeches and her short stories and poems by Frances Foster, but I really like her nonfiction political essays, which you can find in black newspapers. They've been digitized. So in our age, we can actually now get them quite easily.
Thank you for that. And, looks like we've got a few in the audience.
So, about Lincoln. So in the Douglas debates, he does not call for emancipation. In his letter to Greeley in 1862, he says if he could save the Union by freeing no slaves, he would free no slaves.
Yeah.
For Lincoln, where does practicality end and constitutionalism begin?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Lincoln, when did he move towards emancipation, and when did he move towards black rights? In my opinion, Lincoln was genuinely anti-slavery right from the start. But he is not an abolitionist. He knows that constitutionally, and his own state, Illinois, did not give black men the right to vote. Only a handful of New England states, not Connecticut, gave black men the right to vote before the Civil War. So he knows that, right? And he is trying to win a seat. And he's very circumspect when he debates Douglas to differentiate between human rights. He's like, you don't have the right to enslave a person. And he, in fact, uses the image of a black woman. He says a black woman has a right to earn her the fruits of her labor as much as I do. She doesn't use the black man, a black woman, as the most oppressed symbol, right? But on the other hand, he says, look, I'm not an abolitionist, because Douglas is saying you are, quote, a black Republican. Race baiting as a tactic to sow political divisions is an old tactic, and Douglas is constantly doing that. This is Stephen Douglas, not Frederick Douglass, during the Lincoln-Douglas debate. So Lincoln's on the defensive, and you can see him being far more progressive when he's in northern Illinois, and a little less so in southern Illinois. But I ended up writing an essay on Lincoln's relationship to abolitionists in this book called Our Lincoln, edited by my mentor, Eric Foner. And I ended up reading everything that he read. And I was fascinated by this man because in the 1850s, he has a logical argument against racism that really caught my eye and that Eric eventually used in his biography of Lincoln. It was, he just wrote this down as a lawyer. It's a logical problem. He says, A tells B, I can enslave you because you're black and I'm white. And he says, be careful. The first man you meet who's fairer than you has the right to enslave you. You say it's not a question of the color of skin, you say it's intelligence. Be careful. The first man you meet who is smarter than you has the right to enslave you. So this kind of, and I was reading this stuff from the 1850s. You know, what Don Feuerbacher calls prelude to greatness, not when he is, quote, the great emancipator. This is much earlier. So you can see Lincoln, far more interestingly. One of my colleagues in Afro-American studies at UMass, who was involved with SNCC, a radical student movement, Mike Pelwell, told me, did you read Lincoln's, this other piece that he said after the Dred Scott decision? He says, as a black person, I don't think any white politician really described the dilemma of African Americans in a slave society like Lincoln. And I was really surprised to hear him say that because he was very radical in his positions. And he showed me this paragraph where Lincoln says, let me describe the plight of a black man in America. He's behind 10 doors, and the key to each door is in the hand of another person. And that was like, again, and Lincoln has this ability, right, to say these. So there were all these ideas that made me genuinely believe this man was anti-slavery and was not a racist. It certainly was far ahead of a majority of his countrymen. Certainly behind all the abolitionists, because programmatically he does not say, I am for black citizenship until the eve of his death. Now that letter that you referred to Horace Greeley, I would, save the Union. If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing half the slaves, I'd do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I'd do it. He wrote that letter to Greeley, a public letter, in July, after he had already made up his mind to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. No one knew. But in June, Lincoln had met with his cabinet and said, I'm going to go ahead with emancipation. So Lincoln's a politician. He's also trying to carry the country. And the North, which, after all, did include Copperhead Northern Democrats and conservatives who were not at all on board with Lincoln's plan on black rights and emancipation. His own general was going to be running against him because he moved on emancipation. He knows that. So I think it's very easy to take Lincoln and different parts of what he says. To really get to know Lincoln, I recommend everyone read every word he wrote in the multi-volume Roy Basler collected works of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, believe me, it's worth your while. Okay, one last. I'm getting the time thing from Kelly. I'm scared of her. She said she will walk onto the podium if I continue. So this last question, yeah.
Thank you for bringing out all the personalities of the abolitionist movement. I learned a lot just there. My question is, during the Nat Turner Revolt of 1832, what kind of effect did that have on the abolitionist movement, if any? I mean, I would imagine it would really cause a furor and really bring people to light on what was going on.
That's a great question. So the Nat Turner Revolt in 1831, no, that's okay. Only we nerds historians are like really nitpicky about those sorts of things. It took place the same year that Garrison started publishing The Liberator, right? And immediately they connected it. Certainly the governor of Virginia, John Floyd, did. He says, it's these abolitionists. And Nat Turner was, a rebel, fashioned himself as a prophet, who would be fighting for black freedom, right? So they connected it immediately. What was interesting to me was that everyone condemned Nat Turner's revolt because it was a no quarters given revolt. They killed white men, women, and children whom they encountered in their way. Only 2 people defended Nat Turner. One was William Lloyd Garrison in his new, and he's a pacifist. He's nonviolence. He's against violence. But he defended Nat Turner just as he would go on to defend John Brown and defend the Civil War. And George Henry Evans, who was a progressive labor leader. I argue in my book that not just African Americans, but slave resistance is also really important in the history of abolition. And that in order to understand the coming of emancipation, you don't have to just look at these abolitionists and thought, but also at all these struggles on the ground with fugitive slaves, with slave rebels like Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Gabriel, the Louisiana Rebellion. There are just lots that we need to incorporate in the history of abolition because the original abolitionists were the enslaved themselves.